Hello everyone, I'll just give you roughly 10-15 seconds just to load in and then we'll begin. Excellent, thank you everyone for joining. I'm Kyle Holland, market analyst here at Mintec, and today we're going to be looking at the Mintec sunflower seed and oil. And a general market update, we'll talk about things in depth, how the season went, how things are going now, and then we'll move on slightly towards the end to look at some current figures and things like that. So just want to mention that this is being recorded, so if anyone would like to watch it at a later date, perhaps you missed something, that's something you can certainly do. Excellent. Okay, so here's the rough agenda for today. So first, we're going to go through a little introduction, talk a little bit about, who are the key producers, just for those of us who might not be quite as familiar with the market. Then we'll move on to supply, demand, and production, price rises, current market situation, planting intentions, and the nearby outlook of sunflower seed and oil. Excellent. So if we look at the introduction slides here, as you can see, so our key producers really for sunflower seed and oil are Ukraine and Russia. They account for the vast majority of the oil and seed exported onto the global marketplace. Now, some of our key consumers are certainly India, China, and the EU, and they greatly rely on the production from Ukraine and Russia being sufficient to meet their needs. Sunflower kind of in general consumption goes up year on year, globally at least, and they look to the Ukraine and Russia to furnish this need. So very simply, a small planting, harvesting, and flowering window here. So as you can see from the graph, the Ukraine roughly plant April, May is a general time. It does vary, kind of southern Ukraine maybe plants a little bit different. Different areas do tend to plant slightly different times and harvest at slightly different times. But that is the general outlook for Ukraine as a whole. And then we kind of move into the flowering stage, roughly in July, perhaps slightly late June, depending, as I mentioned, on the area. And then we normally see harvesting late August, September, and even into October, depending on, again, very much where the seed has been planted. Russia slightly different, so we see kind of mid-April as their general planting window, into May as well. July again, roughly their flowering season when the seed begins to kind of flourish and starts to grow into a full sunflower seed plant. And then we see harvesting kind of mid-August, usually for Russia. Again, does vary slightly depending on location, but they're kind of general rules. And September, October again. The EU, very similarly, kind of plants in kind of mid-March-ish, sometimes April, depending on when the planting season they would like to plant. And again, kind of flowering and kind of growing, maturing in June and July, and then harvesting August, September, October. Excellent. So I think this is really where we want to kick off and mention some important points. So as you can see on the graph, we have the sunflower seed production estimates for Ukraine, Russia, China, Romania, Argentina, and Turkey. Now, these are generally our key sunflower seed producers globally. So China generally produce a good amount, as you can see, but most of it does not generally leave China. Crops that are often grown in China generally tend to stay in China. In terms of the EU, we can see Romania, one of the key producers in the EU27, and Argentina, key producer in South America, and also Turkey, who in more recent years have begun to plant more acreage of sunflower seed and are slowly but steadily getting up in terms of production. Mainly they import from Ukraine and Russia currently for seed usually, so maybe in future years we'll see them produce more and more as years go on. So I think one key point to mention is, as you can see, Ukraine here, if we look at the 2020 kind of production values, I have the official number in here at 13.1 million metric tons. So at the start of the season, and indeed early on, when planting had not only just kind of started, we saw that a huge kind of generous estimate was given for Ukraine. So we were hearing estimates of roughly 16 to 17 million metric tons of sunflower seed to be produced. Now, what this very much encouraged was sellers to forward sell their crop. So they would sell, for example, early-ish in the season to kind of give it away, deliver it later in the season, maybe October, November, December. Now, as you can see quite clearly, the estimate very quickly became less than that. And we have the official figure, as I mentioned, at 13.1 million metric tons. At the time, it made sense for sellers to sell some of the whole crop to protect themselves against the large oncoming crop, get a good profit, and generally just kind of, insulate themselves against some of those price moves that a big crop would generally normally cause. And big crop would come on, supply would increase, prices then generally tend to go bearish because of that. So the 13.1 million metric tons figure that I've mentioned a few times now It's really important because this is something I want to circle back to in the later slide. So even this figure, and the harvest has long been done quite clearly for 2020, there is quite a raging debate still on what figures Ukraine actually produced. So the 13.1 metric tons, I've heard as low as 12, I've heard 12.5, I've heard much lower figures than the official figure. And as I mentioned, we'll come back to that at the end and perhaps talk about that a little bit more. Okay, moving slightly on. So this is the real crux of why was the production figures so down. If we had estimates of 16, 17 million, what happened? And effectively, the Black Sea region was very, very dry during the growing season. We saw kind of moisture levels dramatically reduced throughout the growing period. So in April, as we saw from the graph previously, that's generally when they might plant. August hasn't quite been harvested yet and was effectively getting very much pounded by the weather during this whole period. So the whole growing period, April to August, even September, it was particularly dry. And if we look at that in comparison to a good year, a good crop year in 2019, we can see the dramatic difference between April 2019 and 2020, August 2019 and August 2020. We can see that the precipitation, as highlighted by the orange, is much, much lower than the average, much worse than what we normally typically see. So as I mentioned, the soil moisture levels particularly took a real pounding. Now, sunflower seed in general is quite good against drought. It does fairly well in dry conditions and does fairly well in quite hot conditions as well. But there was a sense that in Ukraine in particular and Russia and across most of the Black Sea, it was just simply too much. The crop couldn't quite take the levels of dryness and the levels of heat that we did see, dramatically reducing the crop levels and production in general. So that's where that 13 million figure comes in, and perhaps even less depending on who you speak to in the industry. As we all know, there is various opinions within that. So as we can see here, the sunflower seed prices begin to rise dramatically. And this is the impact of the short crop. As I mentioned, the production was simply less, but also other factors as well. So if we look at the sunflower seed price here in late Feb, start of March, we can see the price at roughly, it's bordering on, $800, $820 there or thereabouts, which is indicatively double what we saw in April 2019. And if the graph stretched a bit further on, it would have been a huge graph, so that's why we didn't quite do that. They are the highest prices in roughly 12 years. So 2008 was the last time we saw prices that were a bit higher than this level for sunflower seed, which is the blue line. And that was effectively a super cycle year where there was a huge influx of traders into commodities and all commodity prices spiked massively. Pretty much every commodity you can think of that is traded or has some kind of trading ability went much, much higher, and then a dramatic fall off, as we can perhaps remember in 2009. But why I want to mention the sunflower seed price in particular is that, as I mentioned, due to the forward selling, we saw a lot of seed forward sold. So forward sold for delivery in a period of time, whether that be OND or perhaps even Jan 2021. We saw that quite quickly kind of accelerate out of control. So the crop was shorter, there is no doubt about that. And farmers who had forward sold began to default. Now, some of these not even intentionally. They'd sold perhaps, just for an example, say they had 10 million metric tons of sunflower seed, 10 metric tons, maybe, they had 500,000 metric tons to sell. And simply they perhaps produced 250. Now, this is not an on-purpose default, but we did see some defaults based on the price levels where people were not willing to sell at the price they'd agreed perhaps 3, 4, 5, 6 months ago. So farmers then began to hold stock. So prices were going up so quickly that farmers thought it was actually a very good idea to hold on to the stock they had. So prices were going up maybe 20, 30, 40, even $50 per day at this time period, if we look at kind of the end of 2020 and the start of 2021. So the price has gone up so rapidly, it seemed like a very good idea to hold on to the stock you had, which in turn drove prices higher again. And why this was effectively that exporters who were exporting some of the nations mentioned, so Turkey, for example, or even to China, to Southeast Asia, to the Far East perhaps too, they had downward chains they didn't simply not want to break. So what happened in this time period, while farmers were holding on, we had the shorter stock, we saw exporters offering $5, $10, $15 over market prices to just try and get some seed onto sea to not break their downward chains. And again, as you can see from the graph, turn prices very, very bullish, very much near parabolic in some cases. Parabolic meaning simply straight up, not far off, and that continued for quite some time really, where the values were just simply so high, people were not wanting to sell, and if you did want to get seed, you simply had to pay the price that people were kind of offering, which was extremely high at this time period. So moving on slightly, I want to kind of show the way that stock levels were really influencing this as well. So as we can see that 2019, we had roughly 8.7 million metric tons of sunflower seed stock. Now, these figures have come about where it is enterprises directly growing them and enterprise engaged in storing. And that's where these two numbers are combined. And then that effectively gives us the stock level that we can see here. So as I mentioned, if we look at the blue bar, for example, here, in 2019 to 2020 season, we had around 8.76 million metric tons within the two kind of storage between farmers and storers, perhaps refiners, and compared to roughly 7.24, quite a big drop off already. And in December, indicatively again, we had roughly 8 million metric tons in storage and with refiners against our 2020-21 season, roughly around 6.5. And if we move into Jan, similarly, we can see 7.1 thereabouts for 2019-2020. And then if we look at 2020 to 21, we can see 5.4. I think also it's very important to mention here that the crush rates, so this is where the seed goes into refinery, were very, very similar to 1920s crush rates with a reduced stock. So as we can see indicatively, the difference between, for example, December and Jan figures, it's around 0.9 million metric tons for both, highlighting the fact that the crush effectively remained the same between a good year, as we saw from the graphs in 2019, between a bad growing year in 2020. So it's a very interesting picture, and I think it's very important to remember that this was very much driving the influence and the prices of sunflower oil upwards and sunflower seed as well, because the effect of the lower stock, people were worried about how much supply would be left, where would that supply leave us in a few months, would we start to see rationing of supply, which was very, very seriously considered at some points. Perhaps you might see the rationing. So it's something that perhaps didn't take place, as we'll get onto, but something to consider, and certainly indicatively tells us why prices were going so much higher than perhaps we've seen previously. Excellent. So now we're going to move on to a little bit about kind of sunflower oil prices and what we can see compared to 2019 to 2020, which is our kind of orangey yellow line, and our 2020 being our red line, and finally our kind of blue, kind of turquoisey line being 2021. So as we can see between the two, if we look at, for example, it's graphed from 2019 Jan to 2020 and further on as well. So you can see, I mean, if you look at these points on the screen where the arrows indicatively are, certainly about around week 38, 39, the difference between prices was more or less $200. So really, really, really huge. The extreme price differences, again, caused a little bit of a panic in the market and certainly caused people to consign, and or at least attempt to consign. But there were also those who perhaps didn't quite consign as they might normally. So what I mean by consignment is that normally buyers would generally consign perhaps for Q2, Q3, Q4 of the following year to make sure they have supply. But prices were so high for sunflower oil, and not only sunflower oil, our complex in general, so our rapeseed, our palm, our soil, particularly high at these time periods as well. Many people kind of left off and didn't really consign like they normally might. Also, between this time period as well, high oleic sunflower oil, which carries a premium normally, depending on what quality it is, you know, $100 plus, it can be perhaps even more. We saw the high oleic sunflower oil price come down from kind of 80, 50 in terms of a premium to literally zero. So during much of this time period, there was a zero high oleic premium, which is very, very, very unusual. I think that kind of lends well to the idea of the demand for sunflower oil that was coming out. We saw rapid demand, that the short stock was not indicative and helping us produce that demand. So demand almost went kind of rampant, and that's some of the price we can see. I mean, if we look, for example, at the 2021 line, offers at this time period were roughly reaching, you know, $1,700 a metric ton, which is really, really, really high. That again is roughly a 12-year high since our last commodity super cycle in 2008, there or thereabouts. So that moves me on to why prices now have begun to trend downwards. Now, this is a really, really interesting topic, and I want to take some time to explore this a little bit more. So what has happened is buyers have begun to steadily drop out of the market due to sustained higher prices. What we can see on a sunflower for some period of time, they were trading very, very high. Offers were extremely high. I mean, we were hearing offers perhaps even around the $1,800 a metric ton mark, which is extremely, extremely high for any kind of commodity, particularly sunflower oil. So it was a very particular, interesting time where people, if you didn't consign, like I mentioned just a slide ago, you were perhaps having to consign at some of these levels. You didn't have much choice, because if you needed the supply, you simply had to pay the price that people needed and required for the oil. So buyers now are very much appear to be happy to wait to consign. They, in general, the people I speak to, certainly in the industry, feel that prices will drop further. So they're more than happy just to kind of eke out the supply they have. Offers throughout the last couple of weeks, and indeed probably most of this month, really have started to trend downwards. So last Friday is a good indication of that. Prices opened up at fairly highish levels because of the a few other factors in the market, but then throughout the day went down and down further throughout the day, offers being lower. So it's a very, very important point. It's essentially buyers are more than happy to wait. I think also finally to mention on this slide is the volatility in the oils that we see. So for example, there's some real volatility coming to soy oil. Palm oil is experiencing volatility. Some of the other tropicals are experiencing volatility as well, and this is really putting off buyers effectively consigning, and because they're simply not sure where their levels are, I think is the key factor at the moment for most people I speak to in the industry. With people not being too sure, it puts them off buying, so they try and avoid buying if they can do. So this slide effectively is the fact that sunflower oil, although it is extremely tight, has begun to have its market share snapped up, largely by moves into soy oil and palm, as you can see. So if we look at the kind of orangey yellow line again, we can see that that's CPOR, so that's palm oil crude, CIF Rotterdam, the blue line representing soybean oil, and the red line representing sunflower oil 6 ports option. So it's begun to very much have its market share snapped up. What was once a scramble for supply, as we looked at before, where, for example, the levels of the stock were going much lower, stock levels were being a real worry, that has kind of turned away now, where people are buying very small amounts, but it's almost like a test of the market to see where values actually are. So people, are buying very small consignments, maybe not even 10 metric tons, which it would barely register as a trade in some instances, but just to try and test where prices are. And that's what we see right now. We see buyers kind of buying for maybe 1, 2, 3 weeks, but not kind of consigning the levels we saw before. We saw before people taking long positions on some of these commodities, and we saw very much larger interest from China and some of our international players as well. We did have a brief rally on Friday due to President Biden's biodiesel plans. So effectively, the plan is that America will be using a lot more biodiesel in their fuel industry, and this very much helped soy and palm, although the shine has come off that a little bit this week. It pushed prices higher and effectively did help sunflower a little bit. Prices did trickle into sunflower, and it did make sunflower prices for that day at least a little bit more firm. But again, this has come off, and effectively we see prices trending downwards further. So this is, I mentioned this earlier, so this is the point I was kind of talking about earlier, where I think it's very important to look at the estimates that I mentioned before. So I mentioned 13.1 million metric tons officially from Ukraine. Now, if we look at the graph just to your left, you can see that we have the production figures, estimates from the FAO, and the 2020 figure is the Ukraine Ag Ministry, effectively, their early estimates of what they think sunflower seed, will be produced. Now, if the estimate is 13.5 million metric tons as of the start of March, so if this is realized, it's only 3% more than was produced last year, which is a particularly bad year, and a decrease from 2019, which was a good year, there's no doubt about that, of over 15%. So the early estimates already are causing a huge debate in the industry. There's many people I speak to, and certainly people in the industry, that think the early estimates are significantly lower than what they will be. And this is very interesting because generally, when we see prices as high as they have been for sunflower seed, that $800 dollars metric ton we were looking at, it's very, very important that we look at some of the yields overall. So if 13.5 million metric tons is realized, it is not a very huge crop compared to previous years at all. With crops, for example, in 2018, excuse me, being even higher than that. So typically what happens is when farmers experience good prices for their seed, the oncoming year is much more kind of produced. So we normally see a huge kind of supply increase from Ukraine and Russia, which is something that people are certainly debating about. And also the conditions so far for planting look rather good, which is further in a debate. I think yesterday I was hearing that perhaps the Ukraine Ag Ministry are revising the planted acreage up slightly. So we'll have to wait and see where those figures kind of take us. But it seems currently, at least, the Ag Ministry are presenting figures that are perhaps a bit lower than what people see in the industry as being kind of a key point. So again, also onto the slightly planting intentions again. So supply, although certainly not as much a worry as it has been, we certainly have a tight stock. Most of our veg oils are tight. The stocks are simply not there. Rapeseed oil is particularly tight, canola, if you'd like to call it that. Some of the other oils are tight, palm is tight, production hasn't been quite as increased as we normally see. Palm stocks, particularly in Malaysia, are very, very tight indeed. So with the lack of carry that we have, as you can see from the April estimate figures, maybe below 3 million, it's a long time between now and kind of the new crop. And there is a potential for that to cause some issues going forward. So as I mentioned, buyers are generally happy to wait to consign because they think price will fall further. But this could cause potentially a scramble for supply when the new crop comes on. If everybody waits, when the new crop comes on and kind of is kind of supplied and actually becomes online and on the marketplace, if we see that happen, there's very much a chance that prices on the forwards, as they are currently for new crop, could spike, and they could go much higher than perhaps we have seen previously. Also, the Russian export tax is another bit of a wild card, really. So Russia have just recently announced, for starting from September for 1 year, 70% of the difference between the indicative price, which I believe is based on Reuters pricing, and $1,000 will be the tax on their sunflower oil crude exports. Now, again, this is very much a bit of an unknown, bit of a wild card factor. Russia don't produce quite as much sunflower oil as Ukraine do, and certainly don't export quite as much as Ukraine do. But it's certainly a factor that people probably haven't factored in quite yet, as it is so fresh. We'll have to wait and see. I think also the intention is to increase the export tax on sunflower seed as well. I think from 35 to 50%, there or thereabouts, which again could have a large impact of the values of sunflower seed coming out of Russia and increasing prices there on their out. Excellent. I think that brings me to the end of the presentation. I think we have a few minutes for Q&A. I think we have quite a few questions actually in the chat, so I'll just answer a couple of those if we have time. What can we see? Consumption figures between sunflower oil versus production to measure supply and demand. That was largely in the first chart. Effectively, the consumption figures, I perhaps should have added those, to be fair. I can certainly, you can, if you reach out to me afterwards, you can certainly have a chat about the consumption figures and what we may see between production to measure the supply and demand in general. Off kind of talking without charts and things, India have been kind of importing less sunflower oil. Argentina were an outlet for their sunflower oil for a short period of time because sunflower oil prices from the Black Sea were so high. And we did see them kind of, as I mentioned, importing from Argentina, which in turn turned the Argentinian prices much higher as well, which was interesting, certainly. Does the price of sunflower oil affect, or is it linked to soybeans, rape, and seeds? If this is true, what is the link? So what we would call this is effectively the complex. So what I mean by the complex is that veg oils and seeds tend to be kind of linked, where moves in particularly, so one good example is soy oil and palm. They, because of their use and the way they can be kind of substituted, are generally intrinsically linked. So we almost see the prices go like this. If you can see my hands, they go almost in tandem with a gap between them naturally. So that's what we mean by we say the complex. So to an extent, yes, they do drive each other. Moves in sunflower oil will impact your other oils. As I mentioned, there are more ones that are more intrinsically linked, such as palm and kind of soy oil, which are definitely more kind of linked than some others. Rapeseed and sunflower tend to be linked somewhat. In previous years, we saw sunflower oil less expensive than rapeseed oil. That is not the case right now. Prices for sunflower exploded, and generally rapeseed oils remain fairly cheap. The link is generally the complex overall. What drove the increase in demand for sunflower oil? Was it due to RSO pricing? Generally, the demand has been quite robust from the international market. So China have been buying a fair amount. Also, India were buying a fair amount at the tail end of last year. And in India is quite an interesting one where consumer interests are changing a little bit. They are traditionally quite hooked on palm oil, and that's something they buy in large quantities. But sunflower oil has been a bit of a change where the younger generation are looking for that more, perhaps what they consider a healthy oil, something that is not quite as doesn't quite have quite as bad a reputation as palm does at times. So that's kind of how we see that. RSO pricing generally has remained fairly firm. RSO has gone up, but if we look at some of our charts, not even close to the amount that sunflower oil has. Rapeseed oil is fairly firm, but certainly not parabolic, certainly not straight up as we see sunflower oil. Can you give assessment of how the price will go? That is slightly outside my remit. So generally, we don't delve too much into where we think prices will move. Naturally, more than happy to talk about what I hear from the market. You can reach out to me, as you can see on the screen, at pricing@mintecglobal.com. More than happy to have a chat about what people in the industry expect, perhaps, but I wouldn't give any direct forecast myself on where I think the price will move to. Next question. So, has the increased acreage been planted for the next crop? So, planting will be very, very soon. Generally, as I mentioned, in April. And if we just go back very, very briefly to the previous slide, we can see here the estimates from the Ukraine Ag Ministry. So at 13.5 million seeds, roughly thereabouts to be produced, was their early estimates. Now, as I mentioned, this is already causing debate. Many people think that the planting will be kind of much higher than that, and this is a very low estimate. Now, as we kind of spoke about at the start of the webinar, we saw that even the figures from 2020 are under debate. We hear 13.1 million is the official figure, but if you talk to various people in the industry, some people actually suggest much less than that, perhaps 12 to even 12.5, thereabouts. Excellent. So it's driven the increase. Continue being tight present that sunflower oil has driven the increases in all the other oils. I don't know if I'd necessarily agree with that. I think that the complex for oil has certainly been strong. There's no doubt about that, but the oil kind of had their own almost bullish story it's been causing that. So if we look at palm, for example, the lack of production has been a real kicker. La Nina has been a real kicker for palm prices. The mandates that we see from Indonesia, the B30 mandate, which is Indonesia's biofuel mandate, has kicked prices on there. So I think they have their own fundamentals. I certainly would agree that sunflower oil has helped, but I wouldn't quite go as far to say that it's all because of sunflower oil. I would say partly, but it has its own story to tell, and certainly as do the other oils. Are the low plant estimates a way of keeping prices high? That's a bit of a loaded question. I'm not sure I can fully give that great credence. I think that the low planting estimates, are indicative of perhaps what we'd see from Ukrainian ag ministry in general. That's not to say their planting estimates are bad. It's just it's a very difficult job, and sometimes, I mean, if we look at the USDA, it's not always correct, even from big companies like the USDA and the WASD in general. So it's very, very difficult. Do you see the Hyolic premium staying low into new crop? The Hyolic premium appears to be creeping back up a little bit. So I think I spoke to one of my traders today. This is anecdotal because generally I look at crude sunflower oil, but I think he was saying roughly $100 was kind of the premium that we saw. But it looks very much like it could be a very interesting one for Hyolic. I mean, we don't normally see a zero. The premium is always kind of something, or at least usually something in regular years. It'd be very, very difficult to say that what will happen. I think early plant intentions would suggest that France will perhaps probably plant more Holix sunflower seed, but again, we'll have to probably wait and see on that a little bit. Will there be similar presentations on RSO and palm oil? Yeah, I think there probably will be. Yeah, this is one of my kind of first webinars, but certainly down the line there will be, without a doubt. Ripsol I think is a really interesting one, and palm oil will be a really interesting one too. High in 2021 be right period to buy, is it right to wait for the Black Sea effect in April and then decide? Again, slightly out of my remit, but more than happy to talk to you after the webinar anytime you like. You can email me, you can reach out to me. We can certainly have a chat about that. It'd be great, you know, anyone that would like to reach out and have a chat, you're more than welcome to do so. I speak to people in the market every single day. That's kind of my whole remit, so more than happy to chat and have a discussion about anything, even if you disagree. It's always great to get here another side of the story, and you know, we can then, you know, have a chat about why I think X and why perhaps you think X. So it's excellent. What are your thoughts today on the outcome? I don't think I quite have time for that. I think the time running is rather short. Ukrainian times have freedom of plant response from economics. It's going to take plantings. I've seen these crops in the country. This could make plantings higher than the forecast. So super briefly, Ukrainian farmers generally have freedom. There has been a lot of land laws in Ukraine that have been an issue for farmers, and buying land is actually quite difficult in Ukraine, not as easy as it perhaps would be. For some time there was a land law where they couldn't quite buy it. I think that actually ends in 2021, but that's perhaps a discussion for another day. But it could make plantings higher, certainly. I think we'll have to wait and see. I think the estimates will be revised, and depending on where they go, we could have bumper crop. I certainly think people generally think the crop will be higher than 13.5. That is quite low. The estimates probably would be higher, and I expect to see revisions to those coming out fairly soon. I think that's probably all we have time for. But yeah, again, thank you very much, everyone, for joining. Thank you for your time. It's massively appreciated. Again, the webinar has been recorded, so if you missed anything, if you want to go back and have a look at anything I said, feel free. And just to plug again, if you want to reach out to me, pricing@mintecglobal.com is where you can come. Any questions, any thoughts, if you'd like to, you know, have a chat about the prices, if you'd like to say, you know, hey, Kyle, what are you hearing today in the market? More than welcome to do so. It's absolutely brilliant. Thank you all for your time again, and take care. Thank you.